All right. So let's begin from here. We're still on Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. By the way, the sugya that we did last week, we spent a lot of time looking at the sugya and trying to understand in Rashi, and I pointed out how Rashi had a different girsa. So I did look up in the Dikdukei Sofrim what other girsaot there were. It's quite interesting. I'm not going to spend more time on it here, but there are different girsaot in that sugya, and they lead you in surprisingly some of them surprisingly different ways. I think I'll just leave it at that. Maybe one day we'll go back and look at it in greater depth.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Do you think that certain commentators who didn't succeed in interpreting the text, twisted the text to be able to give it a sense?
Well, so this is what I spoke about last week. I think in this case, the in this case, the girsaot that I saw, there's a girsa that's brought in Ktav Yad Minchen, and it's similar to ours, but it's not the same. And it's no matter how you read this text, it's actually very difficult to put these words together, right? I'm talking specifically about the part of the text, the argument about intaner benotai v'tikach nashim, right? So the girsa that we have is intaner mitashmish v'tikach mitzarot and so forth. But there are variations on this text, and even as we were doing it, I made a slight tikkun in how I understand how Rashi is reading it. So it seems to me that Rashi, I think this is a case where Rashi fixed the text. In other words, he changed it because because otherwise you get into other issues, and it becomes very, very difficult to put the text together, to understand the text using this other girsa. I think Rashi did that. But I saw in the Dikdukei Sofrim in his notes where he quotes another Rishon who had a different girsa, who gives it a whole perush, and I didn't go through it thoroughly. I went through it once, or maybe twice, and he apparently didn't change the girsa, but apparently there are aspects of that Rashi couldn't agree with. So it goes back to what I talked about last week, that I think Rashi held that any given text is suspect, and Rashi had a certain derech in learning, along with traditions that he received. I should emphasize that Rashi, we think of Rashi as sort of fully sprouted from just from nothing. Rashi, of course, learned from other Rabbanim who preceded him, and he looked at other commentaries, and he looked at other things, and he had a certain derech in learning that he received. And so I think it was just a matter that Rashi felt, based on everything that he knew, that there must be this text must be defective, and he fixed it accordingly. There was one other thing I wanted to say about that. Also, as I recall, Rashi, he simplifies the text. See, I was listening to the shir, the recording of the shir from last week, and even as I was giving the shir, and even as hopefully you're going through this yourself, just saying these things, it gets very confusing, right? Because it says, we're saying, im taneh mitashmish v'tikach mitzarot, ema idi idi mitzarot, miktiv im tikach v'im tikach, right? Ve'ema idi v'mitzarot v'chad tzarot titeh v'chad tzarot. In other words, I keep going back and forth on the same words with slight variations. I'm saying idi v'idi mitzarot, or tzarot titeh, tzarot alma. The whole thing, you have to really pay attention just to keep track of what's going on. And Rashi, the way Rashi learns, in a way, based on what I saw in my, first impression, Rashi was also trying to simplify. He was trying to make the text flow more clearly. The other text is even more difficult to follow. But I'm going to leave it at that. Otherwise,
I can ask another question, which
Sure.
interests maybe. In the yeshivot, how do the rabbis consider these problems of girsaot, and do they attend it or just try to get over it or something like this? And
do you mean Bizman Hazeh or his?
yes, no. It is.
I think nowadays, I think this is an interesting question. Look, I only learned in the yeshiva that I learned in. I didn't learn in other yeshivas.
I know.
No, but some people, they learn in different yeshivot. But my impression is that, generally speaking, in most yeshivot, I think they try to gloss over it. I think they try to generally ignore this problem of girsa. I think it's a reaction to
the mechaterim.
Yeah, it was the reaction to the haskala, to the Wissenschaft des Studentens, right? So the Wissenschaft in the 19th century these were religious people who wanted to institute using what were now considered to be modern academic methodologies and apply them to Jewish things, right? And this is when you start to see critical editions of important works. You have like first critical edition of Rashi's Perush on the Torah, and critical edition of Targum Unclus, just to name a couple, right? And then eventually, many other things. So there was a reaction against, as you know, right? There was a big reaction against the Haskalah. And I think that part of what happened in that regard is that I'll give you another example. There was also a reaction against learning Dikduk. Now, and why? Because there were maskilim who were using Dikduk and then starting to incorporate certain concepts from biblical criticism, from Bikorat and Mikra. So there was a big reaction against learning Dikduk altogether, and even pronouncing words properly. These are things that you can see. There were different reactions.
How can you understand Aramaic if you don't know the Dikduk of Aramaic? You can just make up a text without really knowing.
Well, not just Aramaic.
Understanding what's going on.
Also Hebrew. How can you?
Yes, but I know, but in the Gemara.
Right. So in the Gemara, but also in Tanakh. So I think there was I think there was a kind of a fear and there was of these things, and so there was a reaction against learning against them. There was a rabbi I met a number of years ago who told me this also. Somebody who came from a more traditional background than me, but it's interesting, right? Because until the time of the Haskalah, learning Dikduk or learning, apparently learning Dikduk was already something that had gone down. The Yavitz, with Yaakov Enden, in one of the things he published in his lifetime was a Sidur. And one of the reasons he published the Sidur was to show where you should put the accents on different words, because he said already in his time people, weren't praying properly because they weren't pronouncing the words properly. So let's say that's at the very beginning of the Haskalah. It's the end of the 18th century. But he saw that as a problem. It's also a halachic problem when you're davening or when you're laning, right? These are problems. I think the other thing about Girsah, we see that throughout history, not just Rashi, but we see from generation to generation, people were very concerned with this issue of Girsah. Rashi is not the only one who talks about Girsah, but let's say in a standard printed Shas, we have on the page the Hagaot Habach, right? So the Beit Chadash reveals here, because he writes his Hagaot. The vast majority of his Hagaot are tikkunim of the Girsah. That's mostly what they are. And we also have the Gra in many places in his Perushim, also on the Daf and the Gemara. Sometimes he's changing the Girsah. I have not made a close study of either of them in terms of their methodology. I think with the Gra, I think he generally, in the cases that I can think of, that he tries to change Girsah based on what he almost never changes Girsah in the Bavli. But let's say he has Hagot on the Tosefta, and most of the changes that he puts in the Tosefta are to make the Girsah in the Tosefta the way it appears in the Bavli. I'm going to assume that it was much deeper than that, because the Gra would have not done something, in a flighty way. But many poskim, many meforshim throughout the ages were very concerned about this issue of Girsah. But I do have a feeling that in the time of the Haskalah, there was a general withdrawal from that, and people just said, the Vilna Shas is kadosh, and the way it was printed is kadosh, and we don't deal with this unless we absolutely have to. And what do I mean by absolutely have to? Once you start learning other Rishonim, like even in Tosfos or Tosfos, various forms of Tosfos and other Chidushim, that they may bring up issues of Girsah, so then maybe you'll have to talk about it. But I think as a general rule in yeshivot, I think that this sensitivity to Girsah is not something that's taught, and it's something that's left more in the academic world. That's my sense of where we are. It's something that's always fascinated me, because just to build a little bit on what I mentioned last week, we need to consider that that the Chatchila, really everything we're learning in the Gemara was all Torah Sheba'al Peh, and it's written down reluctantly, right? So the Rebbe writes down the Mishnah reluctantly, because in theory it should always be Torah Sheba'al Peh, but there was a fear that it was going to be lost, so it's written down. Now we know that some parts of there were Mishnayot, at least Mishnayot Bodedot, right? There were individual Mishnayot that must have been written down earlier. The Gemara references this notion. There's a concept of the Megillat Starim, right? The scroll, literally a scroll of secrets. Megillat Starim seems to be a reference to an idea where certain traditions, like certain traditions in Mishnah, were written down. They were hidden. They weren't publicly circulated because they were supposed to just be memorized. But it seems that by the time, like the end of the Second Temple period and immediately thereafter, is when people are really worried that things are going to get lost, and they start to get written down. So that there's an idea that when you're dealing with an oral tradition, we know from the Gemara itself, right, where the Gemara will have a discussion and will say, they'll bring a dayah of an Amorah and say such, and we'll say, how can you say that Rabbi Yochanan said such and such, because Rabbi Yochanan also said this, right? He said something else, and then there's a Shakta V'Tarya, and whether it's a contradiction between Tanaitic sources or Amoraic sources, we sometimes have the conclusion that there are two traditions from different students. Different students got different traditions, and sometimes they got two different traditions because maybe the original the Rav that they were quoting, maybe that Rav changed his mind, or maybe there was some problem with the transmission. Maybe there was some problem with the way the tradition was transmitted, and it's very difficult. I just had this in the other shir that I give. There's a Tosfos in Menachos where Tosfos is trying to understand the Gemara there, and then they try to understand it, or they modify their understanding of it based on the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi has a kind of parallel sugya that if you learn the Yerushalmi, it would seem to indicate how to learn the sugya that we have in front of us in the Bavli. And then they ask a kasha and said, but we have another source from Masechet Sofrim. Masechet Sofrim is a later source that's quoting Tanaim, but it was probably compiled already, maybe even centuries after Rebbe. And they say we have a source in Masechet Sofrim that doesn't line up, with the way you're trying to learn. And ultimately, they answered by saying that it was a different tradition altogether. That we're not going to bring a kasha from Masechet Sofrim because in this case, it's clear that they had a different tradition altogether. And you can't reconcile them because sometimes you just have different traditions. In one of the, I guess, controversial figures who spent, I think, most of his life at JTS, at Jewish Theological Seminary, was Rav David Weiss Halivni, who was tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he also studied under Rav Shaul Lieberman, and he developed a whole gisha to understanding the Gemara, and he wrote a few books on particular Masechtot, which he called Mikorot and Misorot. And the idea is that he was trying to always figure out what was the original makor, what was the original source for what the Gemara was talking about, and how was it transmitted? What was the Masorah of that tradition? It's an incredible work because he was a phenomenal Talmud Chacham, and he goes in this in very deep ways. But I think one of the reasons I mentioned is I think he found it, he found a home, as it were, at JTS, and I don't think he found a home, let's say, in a regular yeshiva. I think the same ended up being true for Shaul Lieberman. Shaul Lieberman, for a while, was in Israel. He was at Machon Harry Fischel, but ultimately he did most of his work when he was at JTS. And
as did Heschel. I mean, there's a generation of very interesting people at JTS.
Yeah, Heschel I put in a slightly different category because there were a couple of other, but Heschel is let's say of that group. But I think Heschel, it's a different thing because his major work wasn't concerning Girsaot in the Yerushalmi and the Tosefta like Lieberman, but Heschel, I think, ended up being more comfortable there because of his philosophical approaches, right? He was mainly, and I think he saw himself more as a philosopher. But and there's somebody else, and whose name I can't remember, was also there. So there were certain Talmidei Chachamim who ended up at JTS, who were still very concerned with these issues about Girsa, and with Lieberman, he was very concerned with, generally speaking, Torah Eretz Yisrael, and he was trying to develop he was trying to do work mainly in the Yerushalmi, and one of his works was called the Yerushalmi Kivshuta, which was just on, I think, on Masechet Psachim, and I think maybe Masechet Shabbat. I have it at home. And what he was doing, he understood that the Yerushalmi had not been paid attention to throughout most of history, and he went through in very great depth. And at some point, he switched over to doing the Tosefta because he understood the Tosefta was really the foundation for the Yerushalmi. So then he spent essentially most of the rest of his life doing work on the Yerushalmi, on the Tosefta. If you learn his comments either on the Yerushalmi or on the Tosefta, what he does is this very painstaking work to take whatever, the text as we have it, but then he goes through Gaonim and Rishonim to see not only how they understood the text, but what was the text that they had in front of them. And he analyzes it. So it's like I was mentioning this at the beginning of this year about the Diktukei Sofrim. He does this, but Lieberman does this in a much more deep and systematic way than even the Diktukei Sofrim, which is unto itself is a phenomenal work.
It's like inverse engineering.
Yeah, exactly. It is, right? You're trying to go. So all of these people, they're trying to go back and figure out what was there, what was the original. You can't always figure out what the original text was. You can't. But what you can do, which is what Lieberman does, is he shows you the way it was looked at throughout many generations, the way Gaonim and mainly Rishonim looked at these things and understood them. And then based on that, then you can start, to draw conclusions. In principle, this has always been done because you see it like the Gemara does this same kind of work to try to figure out what Rav said, what Shmuel said, what Rabbi Yochanan said, and then the Amoraim who are trying to figure out what the Tanaim said. It's part of that work. But for the most part, in your regular everyday yeshiva, that it's not just that it's not an emphasis. I think it's really ignored to a very large degree. You can understand it's not an emphasis for, it's not this kind of work is not the kind of work you get into until you have a very firm grounding in how to learn texts. First, you have to understand how do you take apart a text to begin with. Then, when you start to encounter this issue of Girsaot, then what you need to do, maybe we'll do this in greater depth some other time. You have to take each Girsa and then go through the Sugya again with each Girsa and see what are the implications, what changes when you change the Girsa. And why would one Girsa be favored by some people and not by other people? Because they'll have, right? Every word can has an implication. One of the criticisms of the Diktukei Sofrim later on, generally speaking, was widely applauded. The work of the Diktukei Sofrim was the first time that somebody sat down and tried to show critically the different Girsaot in Shas. But one of the criticisms was that he did this selectively. That is, he was basing himself, like I said, mainly on this Munich manuscript, the Ktav Yad München, but he didn't transcribe every single variation. That is, he skipped over variations that he thought were not important. And so some people came back to him and said, that's, you shouldn't have done that. You should have done every last jot and tittle, right? Every single thing. And that's we see that more and more, that people who work in this kind of field, they'll show every single variation, even if it doesn't seem to make any difference at all. But because you never, the idea being, you never know. Maybe somebody's going to come along and say, actually, that does make a difference, right? So there's a certain thoroughness that has developed in the field that I think took some time for people to do. Anyway, I do think it's very fascinating. Also, by the way, I'm still thinking at some point we're going to go back to this Agarata that we skipped over, and there are many variations in that Agarata. I'm going to try to prepare both the way we have it in our Gemara, which is difficult enough, but also to show you some of the variations in the Agarata there. But let's say for practical reasons, it's not something that people, generally go into in a deep way, except when it's clear that there'll be a halachic difference. So let's say in the sugya that we just did, to bring it back, the sugya that we just did, there's not really going to end up being a halachic difference because everybody knows that Tashmisha Mita is Asur and Yom Kippurim. And what were we doing in the last sugya? We're just trying to show how Tashmisha Mita is understood to be an inui, right? Withholding Tashmisha Mita is an inui. We're trying to learn it from this. So halacha l'maaseh, it's not going to make a difference. But in terms of parshanut, in terms of understanding how Amoraim understood the Torah, they could make a big difference, right? And we saw it, like the way they understood, the way they're darshaning the Torah, or the way that, I would argue, when we say I'm using drasha in a very wide, net. That is, it's not just fanciful drashot. These are the way that they're really breaking down that pasuk grammatically in a very, very careful way. So, as a matter of Talmud Torah, it's actually very important to understand what are these different gersot. Maybe there were other ways of learning that we're now not being exposed to, which I can tell you is kind of the case, right? There are other ways of learning the sugya with the different gersot, which would lead you in different paths in terms of the parshanut. But sometimes it's going to make a difference in girsa, in halacha. So with that, we're going to move on to the next part of the sugya. Tanu Rabbanan. Asur lirchotz miktzat gufo kechol gufo. אם היה מלוכלך בטיט ובצואה, רוחץ כדרכו ואינו חושש. אסור לסוך מקצת גופו ככל גופו, ואם היה חולה, או שהיו לו חטאתין בראשו, סך כדרכו ואינו חושש. So, we have this braita, and it tells us these following things, right? That you're not allowed to wash part of your body like all of your body. Meaning what?
The prohibition is for washing the body, so you may say it's the whole body, but it's okay to do a little bit. There's no prohibition.
Right. So So very good. So when we talk about v'chitza, it's clarifying. To what extent is v'chitza asur? even part of your body. It's not just rechitzat kol gufa. V'im haya meluchach betita b'tzoa rochetz kedarko ve'ino choshesh. But there is an exception. That if you were dirty from teat, teat is, it could be plaster, but it's like general schmutz, as I think is how we understand it. And so right, from feces. In other words, if you're dirty with something that, that's something that you would normally wash off, rochetz kedarko ve'eno choshesh. You wash as is one's way, and you're not afraid. Not afraid of, what does it mean, Eino Choshesh? Yeah, you're not afraid. There's no chashash here of being over on the isur of rechitza. And then we say a similar thing about sicha. Asur lasoch miktzat gufo kechol gufo v'inaya choleh. But if you were sick, or if you had chatatin, like scabs, or some kind of sores in your head, sach kedako ve'eno choshesh. So similarly, then you can put oil on as you would normally do, and you're not choshesh that you're over on the aveira of sicha. So we see, and if you remember when we looked at the Rif and the Ran had a long discussion about whether or not these inuyim are asur midiraita or asur midirabanan. And one of the arguments to say that they're asur only midirabanan is because they're not absolute. There are exceptions to them. And the exceptions, they're not extreme exceptions. In other words, these are not issues of life and death. If if you get dirty with something, you're allowed to wash. So then, and similarly, right, if you have scabs on your head or maybe flaking on your head or something like that, you're also allowed to anoint yourself with oil. So we see that you're allowed, or if you're choleh, right, or if you're sick, you're allowed to do. So the exceptions here are not exceptional, right? They're not that. Certainly, in the case of rechitza, you can easily get dirty, and it's saying you're allowed to wash. So then, if that's the case, let's think about rechitza for a minute. So then, what's the real isur of rechitza? In other words, if you're dirty, you're allowed to wash, right? That's what I get from the writing. If you're dirty, you're allowed to wash. So then, what's the point of rechitza? What is the isur of rechitza? When are you not allowed to wash?
It's something that you're washing for pleasure.
So exactly. So in other words, the isur is you're not allowed to wash for pleasure. And then similarly, we'll understand that with sicha. You're not allowed to put on oil or lotion. But if there's a medical reason, that's not for your pleasure, that's for your health. So then we allow that. But the mere fact that there are exceptions, and the exceptions are not extreme in any way. So we saw that some Rishonim understood that this already indicates that we're very lax with this isur, as it were. And so maybe that's an indication that's the Rabbanan. According to the people, like the Rambam who hold that it's d'oraita, then it's more like what we understood in terms of chatzi shiur. What do we understand about chatzi shiur? That we hold halacha l'maaseh, chatzi shiur is asur min haTorah, but you're not chayav karet for chatzi shiur. So it's not that you're allowed to have chatzi shiur, but the Torah doesn't apply a punishment to chatzi shiur. So there's a similar attitude here that the Torah also says you're not allowed to wash on Yom Kippurim, but if you're over, you're not going to be chayav karet, and it puts it into a kind of a more kal category, right? If you eat or drink on Yom Kippur, then you are chayav karet. But these other inuyim, according to this gisha, you're not allowed to do them, even from the Torah, but you're not punished for them in the same way that you would be punished for eating and drinking. So let's go on a little bit. Tana Devei Menashe. So now we have Braita from Devei Menashe, from the house of Menashe. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Midicha Isha Yada Achat B'mayim, V'notenet Pat L'tinok, Ve'ena Chosheshet. Right, so a woman can rinse her hand with water and give bread to a child and not be afraid, right? Not be afraid that she's overet on the Isur of what? What Isur would she not be afraid of?
Rechitza.
Of Rechitza. So, okay, let's read a little bit further. Amru alav al Shamaya zaken shelo ratzah la'achil biyado achat. V'gazru alav la'achil b'shtei yadayim. Right, so they said about Shamaya zaken that he did not want to feed using one hand, and they made a gzeira on him. They decreed upon him that he had to feed using both hands, using two hands. Okay, so before we look at the Gemara, so what do we get from this? We have now this case of Medicha Isha Yada, that she can wash her hand before she feeds her child. So this is also an exception to the Isur of Rechitza. And what do we see? That Medicha Isha Yada, that is, even the Chatchila, that's the implication is even the Chatchila, she washes her hand. So there would seem to be an imperative that there's a reason that she needs to wash her hand before she feeds her child. Because until now, right, in the previous Braita, when do we allow somebody to wash?
Only if they're exceptionally dirty, and so on.
Right. So until now, in the first Braita, the exception for washing was if you're dirty. If you're dirty, you can wash. But now we introduce something. The implication here is even if her hand isn't dirty, because it just says stam v'dicha isha yada. In other words, it sounds like this is what she should do, and that's reinforced from this story with Shammai HaZaken. What do we see from the story of Shammai HaZaken? How does it reinforce this idea? This idea that this is what you need, what you have to do. You have to wash before you feed somebody. How do you see it? What do you see from the story of Shammai HaZaken?
I mean, as I understand it, by saying that, by only using one hand, he's suggesting that it's really not okay, but I'm going to sort of make it as okay as possible. Whereas if the Rabbanan wanted to establish that, no, it's really okay, then they would insist, okay, no, you use both hands. You don't want to create the impression that there's a problem with this.
Okay, so a little bit different. What did Shammai HaZaken hold?
That you should feed with only one hand.
No, what does he say? Amru alav al Shammai HaZaken, shelo ratzah la'achil biyado achat. He didn't want to feed with. You're not far off, but what's the point? What did Shammai Zaken hold?
You should only wash one hand in order to feed.
No.
No,
Again, that's okay. Shelo ratza va'afil biyado achat. He did not want to feed with one hand. So what did he hold about washing your hands in order to feed somebody?
It shouldn't be allowed.
You're not allowed to wash in order to feed somebody. That was the way he held. He didn't want to wash even one hand. So he didn't want to feed with one hand. What's the implication? That he wasn't prepared to wash even one hand in order to feed. Now, what we need in order to understand that a little bit better, we have to understand what is the reason that we say that a woman, presumably it could be anybody, but the idea is that normally it's the mother who's going to feed her child. So Medichai Shayada Achatamayim tells me there's an imperative for the mother to wash her hand before she feeds her child, but she can wash one hand, and that'll be sufficient. So now we have the question. So what's the question? Why does she need to wash her hands at all? Why not just feed the child? In other words,
if she's feeding the child bread, then she needs to wash.
Well, does she? Why does she need to wash? She's not eating.
They didn't know about germs. Nowadays, you would wash your hands anyway because.
Well, did they know about germs or not? So we'll see that in the Gemara in a second. We'll talk about that in a second. But what do we see? There's a notion that for some reason, which is not clear in the Braita that we're looking at, this Edut of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, he's saying that the halacha is that before you feed somebody, so in this case, we're taking the example of, let's say, a woman and her child, that she has to wash her hand before she gives food to her child. And maybe, and the example is bread. But remember, she's not the one who's eating, so why does she have to wash? So it's not clear why she has to wash, but there is an imperative that she must wash. And this imperative is so strong that we bring this story of Shammai Hazaken, who did not want to feed with one hand. And as we'll see, Rashi understands it. In other words, even one hand. In other words, he was not prepared to feed with even one hand. What does that mean? It means that he wasn't prepared to wash even one hand in order to feed. And gazru alav lachil b'shtei yadayim. So the chachamim of whoever the chachamim were connected, they were gozer alav that he had to feed with two hands. That part, Michael Werner, was correct. That in other words, that they wanted to emphasize how important this is. So they made a special zera for Shammai Zaken that he had to feed with two hands. But now we understand from the Reisha of the Braita, what does it mean to feed with one hand or feed with two hands? It means that you had to wash your hand or wash your hands before you gave the food. So why didn't Shammai want to feed with even one hand?
Sorry, I gotta run. So thank you, but I'm in the middle. I don't want to stop it.
Okay, you
I'll
have to
try
go.
fix the recording.
Okay, all right. Take it easy. We'll see you next week, Bezrat Hashem.
So he didn't want to feed with one hand. So that would mean washing at least one hand. He didn't want to wash it.
Right, exactly. In other words, he doesn't want to wash he doesn't want to wash at all. And if he doesn't, the implication is that if he didn't wash, he wouldn't be allowed to feed. He wouldn't be allowed to hand food to, let's say, a tinok, right? To somebody who needs to eat. He wouldn't be allowed to. And he did not want to feed with even one hand. So the implication is just what you said, that he didn't want to wash even one hand. And then they made a gzeira that, no, this is something that is important. And so we're going to tell you now you have to wash both your hands before you feed. To emphasize the importance of washing the hand before feeding. So now the Gemara says, "My ta'ama." What's the reason? Amar Abaye mishum shifta. What's the reason? Abaye says because of shifta. So what's shifta? We don't know. All right. So shifta is, let's see Rashi. So Rashi explains already in the beginning of the Braita, Mitichat Yada. So the Yisha's Mitichat Yada. Lefi sheruach ra'a shora ahalechem hamilkach biyadayim shelo natlan shacharit. Because there's an evil spirit that dwells on bread that's taken with hands that didn't wash in the morning. It didn't do Netilat Yadayim in the morning. The Shem Hashed Shifta. The name of that particular demon, this Ruach Ra'ah, is Shifta. So with that, we can understand just the pshat of the Gemara. My ta'ama. What's the reason? What's the question that Abaye is answering? What's the question of my ta'ama?
Why can one not feed unless one washes?
Very good, right? Why is it that, to put it more in the lashon of the Braita, why is it that one would have to wash at least one hand before handing food to somebody to feed them? So Abaye says it's because of shifta. It's because of this ruach ra'ah, and that's why. So this was considered. So this is another heter. This is another exception for rechitza on Yom Kippurim, that you're allowed to wash not just when you're dirty, but that you would have to wash before you would hand food over to somebody to eat. And they said about Shammai Zaken, Shelo Ratzah Lachil Biyado Achat. Rashi says, Afilu Yado Achat Lo Haya Notel Lateit Pat Livno Katan B'Yom Kippurim. He wouldn't wash even one hand to give bread to his little son on Yom Kippur. So presumably he would feed his son without washing his hand, because he still had to feed his son. But so against washing was Shammai Zaken that he wouldn't wash even one hand in order to do it. But the other Chachamim thought this was so important that they were gozer alav, and to make an example, they said, you have to wash both of your hands. They were so concerned about this shifta. So the point of this Braita, though, is that this is another exception to the Isur of Rechitza on Yom Kippur. But let's take a look for a moment.
Shel,
Yes.
well, today we know that the germs are Ruach Ra'ah, but nevertheless, in that time, the Ruach Ra'ah was Emunat Tefillah. And that's not something which is acceptable.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start to look at this, and I think I had a feeling that you in particular would bring this up. So we're going to start to look at this inyan of what is this shifta, what is this ruach ra'ah, what does it have to do with washing hands? So, just a second. Am I sharing the screen? Yeah. Let's look at what I want to do. We're gonna do this in a kind of a roundabout way. I'm going to start off by looking at Tosos here, and Tosos refers to Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. Actually, hang on a second. Maybe we should look at that Gemara first. This Gemara Masechet Shabbat, Daf Kufchet Amud Bet. Excuse me. It says as follows. Hu haya omer, yad la'ayin tikatzetz, yad lechotem tikatzetz, yad lepet tikatzetz, yad le'ozen tikatzetz, yad lechasuda tikatzetz, yad le'ama tikatzetz, yad lepitabat tikatzetz. Yad legigit tikatzetz. Yad misame, yad mechareshet, yad ma'ale polipus. So what does all of that mean? I think we're going to go into this a little more next week, but just as a quick introduction. Just a second. So hand to the eye, tikatzetz. If you put your hand to your eye, it tikatzetz. It should be cut off. Your hand should be cut off. If you put your hand to your nose, it should be cut off. And v'chein hala, all of them, right? You're not allowed to touch these various parts of your body, and if you do, then you should, it should be cut off. So Rashi here says, Yad la'ayin shacharit kodem she'yitol yadav. Yad la'ayin, what it's talking about is you shouldn't put your hand on your eye in the morning before you do netilat yadayim. Tikatzetz, what does it mean? Noach lo shetikatzetz. It's literally, right? Noach lo shetikatzetz. That is, it might as well get cut off, is how I would translate that. Why? Shuruach ra'ah shora hayad unisamto. Because there's a ruach ra'ah on his hand, and it's going to make him blind. If he touches his eye, it's going to blind him. V'chein kulan. So you might as well cut off his hand rather than have the hand touch his eye, because then he'll go blind. And so on and so forth for all of them, right? So all of these things have to do with this idea of netilat yadayim, and that there's this idea that there's a ruach ra'ah that we can overcome by washing our hands. So I think we'll look at this a little bit more closely next time, but for the moment, let's look at Tosfos on our sugya, and we'll go through this, and I'll show you some interesting things. But we're going to be, I think what we'll do today is we'll finish up Tosfos, and I think that'll be enough for today. And then next time, I'll try to actually send you the Mikorot in advance so you can see. And I'll also just point out now, in case you're wondering, that the Rambam doesn't bring this down. The Rambam doesn't bring down these halachot. So you may understand that the Rambam didn't hold them lahalacha, although the Rif does. The Rif does bring them, and we'll talk about that next week. So here in our Gemara in Yoma, we have the Abai is saying that the reason that the woman or whoever is feeding somebody on Yom Kippur has to wash, they would have to at least wash one hand is Mishum Shivta. Pirush Rashi. Rashi explains Ruch Ra'ah Asherah HaYadayim Shelo Natlan Shachrit. Right. So basically, we saw this in Rashi. That Shivta is this evil spirit that's on the hands that were not washed, that did not do Netilat Yadayim in the morning. Rabbeinu Tam Mefaresh, the Belonati Nat Pat L'Tinok Mutar Litol Yadav Shacharit B'Yom Kippurim. Rabbeinu Tam explains that even if you're not feeding a child on Yom Kippur, you're still allowed to do Netilat Yadayim in the morning on Yom Kippur. Right, so Rabbeinu Tam here is making an important halachic statement. We might understand from our sugya that you're not allowed to wash, right? What are the exceptions? You're allowed to wash if you're dirty or if you're feeding somebody. But otherwise, we would understand from the Gemara, you're not allowed to wash at all, right? So Rabbeinu Tam says, actually, you're certainly allowed to do Netilat Yadayim in the morning. Why? Your hands, when you wake up in the morning, they're not worse. In other words, it's no different than if your hands would be dirty with schmutz and with feces. That about those things, if you have titur tzoah, the Braita says that you wash normally and you're not worried about being over on rechitza. Ve'ein lecha meluchlach b'titur v'tzoah yoter mizeh shelo natal yadav shacharit she'eino reshai ligab b'fiv v'lechotmo oznav v'leinav k'damar b'perek shmona shvatzim. So he says you don't have an example of something that's worse, right, than having your hands dirty with tit and soah than your hands when you wake up in the morning. In other words, when you wake up in the morning, it's already as if your hands were dirty, literally dirty. It's as if they have literal dirt on them. How do I know? Because I see this Gemara, Masechet Shabbat. It says Yad Lepeti Katzeitz v'chule. Right, so that's the Gemara that we glanced at a moment ago, and I understand that there the Gemara is telling me that you have to wash your hands every day, because otherwise tikatzeitz, otherwise it's your hand might as well get cut off because of what you're doing. Mishum bat melech v'shifta, because of bat melech and shifta. The shifta is the shifta we're talking about here. Mishum bat melech, v'chulei mishum bat melech. V'shifta dahacha inyan acher havai. Sheshoreh ha'ochel k'shebad litein peh l'tinok. So he's saying the shifta that we're talking about here, he's disagreeing with Rashi. Rashi says shifta is a ruach ra'ah that's on your hands. He's saying here the shifta is something else. Shifta dahacha inyan acher havai sheshoreh al ha'ochel. It's some kind of a something that's on the food. Kishabali ten patla tinok ben arba v'chamesh shanim v'chonakto. There's some kind of a shifta that's on the bread that if you go to feed a child who's 4 or 5 years old, it will make them choke unless you wash your hands first. In lo natal yadav b'ota sha'a. If you didn't wash your hands at that moment. Af al pi shekvar natalan shacharit. Even if you had already done Netilat Yadayim in the morning. So, Rabbeinu Tam is saying, I disagree with Rashi's pshat in the Gemara here. Shifta is not the ruach ra'ah that's on your hands. It's a ruach ra'ah that's on the food. And the only way that you can prevent something bad happening from somebody eating this food is that before you handle it, you have to wash your hands. And that somehow that will do away with the shifta that's on the food. And what's the point? Because why does Rabbeinu Tam come to this? Because he says, anyway, you have to wash your hands in the morning. That's how he starts off. Everybody, you have to wash your hands in the morning when you get up, even on Yom Kippur, because of what we learn in the Gemara on Shabbat. The Gemara on Shabbat tells me I'm not allowed to touch any other part of my body until I wash. So how could it be that when the mother is going to feed her child, that she didn't already wash her hands? She must have already washed her hands. And nonetheless, there's a special exception for her to wash her hand before she feeds her child. So why is that? It's mishum shifta, because shifta is not on her hands, it's on the food. So even if she washed her hands before, she has to wash them again. And that which the world right now, that people generally are not careful about this. In other words, nobody is worried about this shifta that's on food anymore. Because this particular ruach ra'ah doesn't dwell in, in our kingdoms, and right in the places that we live now. That is, this was a problem that they had in Eretz Yisrael hundreds of years ago, but we don't have this particular ruach ra'ah in our places. In the same way that we're no longer worried about gilui and zugot. So do you know what gilui is? Gilui is, so you may have heard this concept. It's a halachic concept. You weren't allowed to leave food or drink uncovered overnight because of the fear that a venomous snake might put its venom into the food or into the drink. And if you did leave something open overnight, it was asur. You weren't allowed to have it because of the sakana that it might have poison in it. That was gilui. So we're not makpid on gilui anymore, because for a similar reason, we're not really worried that venomous snakes are going to put venom into our food. Zugot is something else, which I'll explain next week. I want to bring you an example, and I can't think of an example right off. So, but these are things that we're not concerned about anymore halachically. The point, if I summarize Tosos, the halacha is saying that you have to wash your hands on Yom Kippur when you get up in the morning, the same way that you would wash every other day of the year. And the reason you're allowed to do that is because it's essentially no different. It's no worse than what we say that you're allowed to, that you wash your hands when you're dirty. When you wake up in the morning, it's as if your hands are automatically dirty just for having slept through the night. And then in addition, if before you feed somebody, you would wash your hand again, at least the hand that you're going to feed with. If you're in a place where you're concerned about this shifta, and the shifta, according to Rabbeinu Tam, is some kind of ruach ra'ah that's on food, that the only way to keep it from being transferred to whoever you're feeding is for you to first wash your hand. So he doesn't explain exactly the mechanics of it, but that's how he understands the Gemara. And then he says the halacha, the conclusion is, we're not makpid on this anymore. That is, apparently, we don't have to wash our hands or our hand before we feed somebody. But you do have to wash your hands in the morning when you get up. So I think everyone's getting tired, and it's a good place to stop.
I'm sorry.
No, I know, but I see you struggling, and you really participated as much as you could, which was a lot. So I appreciate your efforts. But I also think it's a good place to stop, because what I want to do next time, I want you to, you can look at this. This is in Shabbat Kufchat Amud Bet at the end of the page. Beli Neder, I'll send you the Marei Mekomot. You can look here. You can look, and this you can look in the Shulchan Aruch. You can look in the Mishnah Berurah. That this is in the Shulchan Aruch Siman Daled at the Orach Chaim. It's the fourth Siman. It's because it has to do with what you do in the morning, and this is where the Shulchan Aruch talks about washing your hands in the morning. So you can look there, and it may have one or two other Marei Mekomot. But yes, so it's an interesting thing. So I'll just finish off by saying, I think what we need to think about, right? So now we come with all of our modern ideas, and we say, well, they didn't know about germs, and germ theory only gets developed in the 19th century. But they were on to something, right? In other words, they do understand that there are things that you can't see that can harm you, and that there may be certain protections that we can afford ourselves. One of them being washing our hands. Washing our hands is going to have some kind of an effect on these things that we can't see. I'm saying this is very broadly, right? This is a very broad understanding. This is what I would say. So we'll leave it at that. It's something to ponder. And then next week we'll talk about it some more. Paul, you want to say something?
Yes, I ask myself, I wonder, why turn general rules of living, which are necessary to take care of oneself and of the others, why turn them into a halakha? Because halakha is something much more severe than just a general rule for living.
So I would turn that on its head, and since you mentioned it, I want to take a note for next time. Actually, Chazal understood that taking care of yourself, right? There's an imperative from the Torah. There's an imperative that you have to take care of yourself. And so it becomes integrated in halakha that there's certain things that you must do in order to protect yourself. And ad kedei kach, that the Gemara says that we're more machmir in sakana than we are in isur. Things that are of sakana that could really be harmful to your health or to your life, Chazal were more machmir about them than they were about isur. And believe neither, I'll bring you examples of that next time, because it's all part of this discussion. What you bring up is a good point, and that's what I'll.
When would pekuach nefesh overriding Shabbat be an example of this?
So in a way, yes, I would say yes. What I'm going to show you though is examples that are more in line with like this idea of gilui, or this idea of washing your hands. There's certain things that were more that I shouldn't say, but it's in line with the same idea. In other words, these are things that Chazal understood to be pikuach nefesh, and so we had to be very careful about them. And what does it mean that they're more machmir about sakana than isur? Is that in isur we know that let's say basar b'chalav, at a certain point, you can get you can have basar mixed with chalav, but let's say the basar will be batel, or the halav will be batel, right? And we'll let it go at a certain point, because we'll say halachically, bitul will have changed the identity of whatever it is that was the isur. So the isur can go away, but sakana doesn't go away in statistical calculations. If there's a sakana, then you have to be extremely machmir about that under all circumstances. So yes, it's in line with the idea of pikuach nefesh, which will be a major subject of later on in this chapter, because as we saw, this is where we derive the phrase of pikuach nefesh. It's from the Mishnah here in Yoma. So we'll spend a little time next time looking at this issue about washing in particular, and as a general introductions to things that have to do with sakana and how Chazal saw them, and how Rishonim understood this issue of what is a shifta, what is a ruach ra'ah. We could spend a lot of time on this, but I'll just try to introduce you to some of the Makorot, and I think it'll be interesting. So I think we'll leave it at that. In any event, everybody gets some rest. I have to tell you, I haven't slept well for myself in the last few days, and it's really not pleasant. So I wish everybody a good night's rest. Michael, did you sort out a bicycle for yourself?
I bought myself a new bicycle, a very nice one. Spent more than I can afford, but it's I mean, the amount of riding that I do, and I think I needed a good one, and hopefully I'll get some insurance money back. Be very nice. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but it'd be very nice.
You have insurance.
I have renter's insurance. Yeah, I have renter's insurance that covers both my storage locker in America and my apartment here. So it's an American policy, but it's actually, ironically, because my grandfather was military, I can get onto sort of the kind of insurance that military personnel use, when they're posted overseas.
Well, I think that gives you at least a reasonable chance of getting at least some of your money back, right?
I mean, I don't have. It's. It'd be nice. It'd be nice. It'd be nice if I could. It would be very nice if I could. There's certain, and there's certain challenges.
I understand. Well, enjoy.
It's good. Having very good bicycle technology has done amazing things in the last 8 years.
I know. It makes a big difference. So enjoy your new bicycle. Ride safely. Make sure you have a good lock. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. יישר כוח.
Yeah.